Hi everyone, today we're fortunate enough to have Rob here with us. He'll be tying the rusty rat and the Ingall's butterfly, two well-established and very effective Atlantic salmon patterns from the east coast of Canada. Rob himself has been guiding in southern Ontario for the past 25 years, but he finds his roots in Nova Scotia, where he spent his childhood and early adulthood chasing Atlantic salmon and whatever else that swims in the lakes, rivers, and oceans of our east coast. Today, Rob is also a Fly Fishing Federation certified casting instructor, and he's a master of casting both single-handed and double-handed rods. Currently, he is also writer, editor, and co-host of The New Fly Fisher, which I'm sure you've caught an episode of on YouTube or on television. We're so lucky to have Rob with us today, and we hope you enjoy the show.
When Robin and I were originally talking, we had for whatever reason he thought Atlantic salmon flies would be a good option, and of course I asked him if there was some Atlantic salmon fishermen in the group, and he indicated that there was, and that's right in my wheelhouse. I that's how I cut my teeth. I started fishing for Atlantic salmon. Excuse me, I'm just trying to find a different hook here that's not so shiny. So as I was saying, when Robin and I first started talking, I relish the idea of doing Atlantic salmon flies because I don't get to tie them as much as I'd like. I've done a couple of trips over the last few years and have had a chance to get back behind the vise, but this is really where I cut my teeth, both in fishing and in fly tying. So I thought I'd do a couple of sort of iconic North American patterns, the rusty rat and the Ingall's butterfly, which also happen to be two of my all-time favorite flies. I probably caught more fish on the butterfly than I have on any other fly that I tie. And all I'm doing here right now, guys, is just laying down a base layer and talking as I go. So I've probably caught more salmon on the Ingall's butterfly than I have on any other fly. But it's probably because I use it far more frequently than most flies, other than bombers. I'm a dry fly guy, and when the bomber fishing is good, that's what you'll see me using. But when it's not, and I'm swinging flies, and Ingall's, the rusty rat, blue charm. Of course, you can't go wrong with a blue charm. Anybody that knows anything about Atlantic salmon fishing, the blue charm might be the most iconic Canadian produced fly of all time. But so depending on the pattern, I'm always using, when I'm tying Atlantic salmon flies, I'm always using reference points. In this case, I'm going to use the point of the hook as my starting point here. Okay, so I would typically, if I took any hook, I like to say there's like four major reference points that, and this is how fly tyers, commercial fly tyers, maintain consistency. You've got the eye, and then halfway to the point, and then the barb. So when someone says bring the material back to the barb, that's where you bring the material back to. And if you do that every time you tie that same fly, you're going to end up looking like a fly that was tied from a machine. So I'm going to start this pattern right at the hook point here, and I'm using some small Vivus French tinsel, and I'm going to make a little butt. This is a traditional rusty rat tied the way it was traditionally tied. So it starts off with the small tinsel. You're going to make about 5 wraps. So I'm catching that just on the inside or the underside of the hook, and I'm going to advance the thread forward until I can get about 5 wraps on it. So I'm going to go, there's my butt. And although the fish don't care, you want to keep that as edge to edge as possible, not to expose any of the red fringe under it. The fishermen are far more critical than the fish are. Okay, so this is peacock sabers, and I'm going to take about 5 of them and just pull them down at a right angle, so that when I pull these off, they're going to come off so that the tips are nice and even when I go to tie it in. Okay, if you pull it off, if you pull it straight off the quill as it is, some of the tips will be ahead of the others, so it just won't be even. And again, the fishermen are far more critical than the fish, but we like to, maintain some consistency. This tag is going to go just to or just beyond the hook bend. Okay, and I'm going to do a soft loop, or a pinch loop, sorry, and just pull that down, and there's your tag. Now, I'm going to mention something here. Whenever you're tying with natural material like this, any of your herls, whether it's peacock or ostrich, depending on how old it is, it has the tendency to get a little more brittle. So my first couple of turns on this are going to be fairly soft, but then as I get into about 3 turns, I can torque it down just a little bit. Okay, and that's where you're going to get your security from. But what that does is you're not going to run the risk of having the thread cut the natural material. And incidentally, right now I'm using 8/0 uni thread in red, because this fly does traditionally have a red head, a red head. So I'm just going to use that throughout the fly. And now, just to build up the body a little bit, I'm going to take it up to about the halfway point, and then just break those off. They're gone, and now you can see the tail and the tag. Now I'm going to come back to where I started. I like the way that tail is sitting up. I'm going to take my uni, or my Viva French tinsel again. And here's a little trick if you guys are really looking to tie a salmon pattern or a steelhead pattern. Any guys that are endeavoring to get into spay flies, if you take, I know it's hard to see, but if you take that uni tinsel, whether it's uni or Vivus or whatever, and just bare the last like 1/16 of an inch, what happens is you'll pull the tinsel off and reveal the core. I know that that's hard to see, but all I did was just sort of pick it off with my fingernails. Now, when I tie that in, I'm going to tie it in from underneath. A couple of 2 or 3 securing wraps, and I'm good to go. Now, here was my issue. For some reason, I can't for the life of me find the Rusty Rat orange or yellow that I normally use. This is the color that we're looking for, and this is in a thread. But I'm going to show you a quick sort of a quick little method of turning this. This is probably 100 denier thread. I'm going to turn that into a floss that I'll use for the back half of my body. I'm going to pull a fair amount off here. Okay, and cut it. So I probably got, I don't know, probably 3 feet of it. Now, what I'm going to do, and this is not what I would normally do here. Normally, what I would be using is one of these various silks, or any of the synthetics like uni silk, uni floss. That's the word I'm looking for. The uni floss. So these are the little more high end flosses, but I couldn't find the orange. So because I want to tie a traditional fly, all I'm going to do with this is I'm going to take it, spread my fingers out a bit, and wrap this around my fingers, and I'm essentially going to make a floss, because I'm only using a small amount of this. And just by gathering that together, you can see how I've taken that from 100 denier up to about well, let's say a 700 denier, so more of a floss. So this is what I'm going to use for my floss. And I'm going to secure this in coming under the thread. And then I'll pull it back. If you can see, what I want to do is I want to pull this floss that I made back to about the halfway point. So I'm just going to take a needle. I need a better needle. That's not a better needle. That's a better needle. I'm going to take this back to the halfway point. This is where I'm going to start the second part of the body. And I can secure it. And again, by leaving that material under there, you're just going to build the mass up a little bit on the body. Twist that back so it's staying fairly uniform. And just pull that back. So now that I've got this floss-like material, I got one little straggler there that I'm gonna eliminate and take a set of good tackle pliers, and now I'm going to start turning that, watching not to hit my phone. Keep that just overlapping so I can maintain a reasonably nice taper up to the halfway point between the hook point and the eye. Now, for whatever reason, I don't think anyone knows why, so many Atlantic salmon patterns have these little nuances to them. The original Rusty Rat, I just got to get rid of that straggler. The original Rusty Rat required for this floss to form almost an underwing. So all I'm going to do with that is I'm going to take it up and I'm going to tie it off on the top. So now that straggler is there. See that? I'm going to take that back to the length of the tail and give it a cut. Probably a little longer, maybe a little longer than I wanted. That's about it. And then with one of these little brushes, I can just sort of brush that out. And that's the underwing, the floss underwing of that Rusty Rat. You got to remember that when the majority of these North American Atlantic salmon flies are being tied, we were using, the early guys were using materials that weren't readily available in Europe. So all of your traditional featherwing flies, like your Durham Rangers and Jock Scotts and Green Highlanders, that they were tied with fairly exotic birds. That most of them came from the hat or the mill industry. And when the fishery came to North America, they didn't have that, so they had to go with the materials that they had available. Don't ask me where they found Peacock at the turn of the century, but they did. And so utilizing the local creatures like beaver and fox and squirrel. Of course, swirltail is huge in a lot of Atlantic salmon patterns. It just kind of it changed the game a little bit in that we all of a sudden didn't have to spend 2 hours on a fly because we weren't worried about marrying wings and taking the time and all the other BS that's involved in making the married wing or the traditional salmon flies. So the front of the body for the Rusty Rat is just your garden variety peacock herl. And I'm going to show you a neat little trick here. If none of you ever seen it, I've taken about 6 pieces, and I'm going to secure this in right here at the junction of the 2 pieces, or the two parts of the body. And again, I'm going around that fairly softly with not a lot of downward torque. Now I can start to torque it down a little bit to secure it into place. I'll take that to the front, and now just rip that off. You're always, the reason I tend to go with more pieces. See, one broke already, so I just eliminate that. I tend to go with more pieces than I think I need, because inevitably 1 or 2 of them is going to break in the process. But to secure that, I'm going to form a dubbing loop that's going to be the same length as this peacock herl. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm just establishing a core. So there's your sort of standard dubbing loop. Come in there right at the underwing. Couple of wraps. Tighten it up. And now I can go forward. So now, with, I don't know how well you can see that, I've just got the red thread in a dubbing loop. I'm going to bring it together with the peacock herl, okay, and use a connector, which I don't see in front of me. I'm not using a connector. I'm going to use a, set of hackle pliers. I'm just going to gather all of that material together. So now I've got the thread and the peacock herl all together, and I'm gonna make about 5 or 6 twists. You're going to see this, the lower section will start to turn and become more chenille-like than the aft section there. So once I get it sort of almost chenille-like, I'll start turning it onto the hook. And again, this is something that can be used in your prince nymphs, any bodies that you're using, where you're using peacock herl or ostrich herl. And with every turn, I just put another couple of turns in it. It's going to make that body a little more robust, a little more dense, I should say. And it's going to be a lot more secure than just 2 or 3 pieces of peacock herl, because the minute a fish, if you hook a fish and it starts to sort of gnarl into that, once one of those breaks, the fly is rendered useless. And with this, it's a lot more durable. And again, you're going to get a lot denser, a lot more dense body out of that. So I'll get rid of the hackle pliers. Put that back there. And secure that on the bottom. Cut that out. Guys, feel free to jump in and ask any questions as we're going along here. I think one of the unique things about salmon flies, and I think that we can cross this over into the Great Lakes steel, or into steelhead as well, is the majority of the flies that we're tying don't really represent anything in nature. We know that Atlantic salmon don't eat when they hit the fresh water. Within days of entering the estuary, they're feeding, or they're not just their desire to feed, but their ability to feed is stopped, because all of their nutritional stores have gone to their reproductive systems, and they've got one goal in mind right now, and that's to get upstream and spawn. So the question always remains is, well, why do they bite a fly, or why do they eat a fly? And I always like to say, why do they bite a fly? Because they're not actually eating it. So the three most common theories to that is, the first one is there's like a recollection or an imprint of their life as a juvenile, from the fry through the par and smolt stage, And if any of you have ever fished Atlantic salmon and happened to hit a smolting event during any kind of a hatch, you'll know that they're even far more aggressive on the surface than a trout is. I remember times when I was a kid on the LaHave River at home in Nova Scotia, where the smolts would become a nuisance because you couldn't get a fly to the holding salmon for the par and the smolts eating your fly. So they're very aggressive at these stages, and that theory of imprinting suggests that once they leave the ocean and re-enter the river's atmosphere, there's a recollection, so that they're not eating these flies that are swinging just beneath or on the surface. They're just kind of lashing out at them. The second theory is just plain old curiosity. Fish don't have the ability to see what something is. They don't have little fishy hands. So the only way that they can sample something is with their mouth. And then the third, and this is why you'll see guys in the fall in rivers, areas that do have extended seasons, like Newfoundland and New Brunswick, guys will start using much bigger, aggressive, in-your-face patterns, like big bully buggers, flies with eyes on them, and that kind of thing. And that's the idea that the fish are, once they enter their spawning range, they're so aggressive that they will lash out at anything that gets in their face or in their way, and they'll attack it with their mouths. So these flies that we're tying don't really represent anything in nature. They do catch fish, and they're fun to tie, but the rusty rat, I can't get inside the head of the dude that invented it, but the rusty rat wasn't meant to imitate a caddis or anything like that. It's just flash. You've got natural flash in the tail with the peacock saber, and again, the flash in the peacock herl is the body, and then the addition of a rib. So what I'm going to do here is with a size 6 salmon fly, we would typically want about 5 open turns of rib. I just have to move that little underwing out of the way a little bit, and keep those as even as possible. As I said, Robin, I know that you've seen me tie enough at the shop. You know, I'm probably a little more anal retentive than most, but as I've always said, I tie my flies as much for the fishermen and my own credibility as I do for the fish, and it just makes me feel better when I'm fishing a fly that I'm happy with. I probably throw as many flies away as end up in my box, or shave them off with a knife. But that's the Scotsman in me.
I know, we're a bunch of cheap pricks.
So the rusty rat was traditionally tied with gray fox or silver fox, gray fox, silver fox. This is my because I had to do a commercial order last year. This is my silver fox patch, which was so picked over, I had to go through it tonight and pick out just enough strands. All that's left is underfur. Just enough strands to do this fly. You can also tie the fly very nicely, though, and 90% of the guys out there now are tying it with gray squirrel. You can cut off a tuft of gray squirrel and very nicely turn that into a wrap by stacking it. So what I'm going to do is, just because I'm unsure of if I've got enough of the gray fox, I'm going to take a little bit of squirrel, and I'm going to talk about my percentages here for a second. Just pull the loosies out. So that's all I've got, just a fairly sparse section. I'm going to put that in a stacker and stack it. I think with any fly we tie, whether we're tying salmon flies, steelhead flies, trout flies, you're always better off to err to the side of more sparse than more heavy. Okay, that's all I'll say about it. Yes, high water flies tend to be more heavily dressed, but as a general rule, I think you're better off to err to the side of more sparse than more heavy. So you're going to see here, I've stacked those ends, and again, that's probably even more than I want, because I know I've got enough of the fox. I'm just going to make a little bit of an under wing. I'm going to take that back to about halfway, the halfway point of the peacock saber tail, okay? And again, I'm going to make a couple of soft turns and secure it. And I'm just going to quickly reorient that to the top. See, even that now, I think that that's a little too much. I'm going to back that off, and I'm going to take out about 40% of it. There's that anal retentive side of Rob Heel, Robin. Now replace that again, pinch that off, and secure it. Just make sure it's on the top. Now, as I said, I did get enough of the silver fox, and I put that in a stacker. And you can see the two are very, very similar. The silver fox is it's a little more rigid. I'm going to pull some of those sort of errant hairs out. And I'm going to make that just a hair shorter than the squirrel tail. Okay. Again, pinch, wrap, one turn, secure it down, and there's your wing. Okay. I like with my Atlantic salmon flies, I like that wing to sort of prop up like that. So I'll actually work to make a bit of a ramp at the body, just to make it sit up a little bit. Again, that's more for me than the fish. I just don't like them to collapse when they're in the water. So now I'm going to cut off that excess front stuff, and a couple of little stragglers there that need to go. And now I'm going to take some grizzly. This is going to be the collar. And depending on who you talk to, I would say I want the collar pieces to be about 30% the length of the body. So for this one, and I only need to get about 4 turns out of this. So just a quick sort of eyeball gauge. That looks about good to me, but I'm going to take it just a little shorter and just use that front section there. Okay. Pardon me. Now, a little trick with doing hackles. This particular quill is it's pretty thin and webby. I don't really have to do much to it. But if I had a thicker quill, you may want to flatten that out a little bit. And you take a pair of hackle pliers and don't clamp it right down, because you could break it. But I'm just going to put about 50% pressure on that, and I can flatten that quill out pretty well, so that first of all, it gives me an advantage when I start turning it around the hook. It's going to be turning on a flat plane or a flat surface rather than the round surface of the quill. The other and far more important part of tying in any hackles, whether it's a dry fly hackle or a hackle on a wet fly or a palmered hackle, anything, is when you start tying that, when you secure that, don't catch it right at where the barbules meet the quill. You want to come back so that you've got a good quarter turn or a half turn on the quill. And I'll show you a little better when I put the fly in. So I'm going to secure this from the bottom. And essentially what I'm doing is, I hope that when I turn this the right direction, you can see how much of the quill is exposed. In this case, I've got a good 1/8 of an inch of the quill exposed before the barbie will start. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to get that hackle going in the right direction. As I'm sure you know, hackles all have a natural curvature to them. In this case, the curve is going this way. Okay, if I flip it up, it's going that way. You want these hackles to be going back towards the hook point. So now I can take my hackle pliers with this short hackle, and I can get that going in the direction that I want, and I'll assist it a little bit. As I come through there, I'm just going to pull those barbules back, but I can get that going in the right direction so that you get a nice swept wet fly look at the top and the bottom of each turn. I'm gonna pull it back, and this is what makes or breaks the fly. Is that collar. That's about all I need. I'm gonna back that off and secure it. Now I've got enough of a enough space behind the head here that I can kind of assist this collar. I'm just going to push them back, and I'm going to make about, just to help finish off the head, I'm going to make about 4 turns and just start catching that quill just until that hackle lays down like that. And that's what we're looking for. Okay. If I had my drathers, I would have taken, and again, not that the fish care, but I would have taken that hackle off and found a webbier hackle. But that fly will still hunt any day of the week. And that is the rat. I don't put head cement on any of my trout flies, but like my small stuff that I know I'm going to lose, either hopefully in a fish. No, I shouldn't say that. I never like losing flies in fish, but I'm going to lose on bottom like my nymphs, that I never put head cement on. But my Atlantic salmon flies, steelhead flies, bass flies, multi-catch flies, I'll always put a little head cement. And that is a rusty rat tide, is about as traditional as you can. The only thing that I didn't do with that fly that a traditional Atlantic salmon fly would do is I always put my rib on the same direction I'm putting the other material on. Part of the reason of the rib is security. So you would cross wrap that or wrap that in the opposite direction to help secure it. But that never made sense to me because maybe just because I'm not that dexterous. So, but anyway, that's the rusty rat. So let's talk about hooks a little bit, just briefly. The majority of traditional Atlantic salmon hooks are the that upturned sort of elegant. That's the mustad with the upturned eye and that sort of swept rear shank, and then the other popular one. This is a traditional sprout hook, which is your traditional nymph. Camisang calls it the B125, but it's the traditional sprout hook. So it's a slightly shorter shanked hook. No matter who you talk to, there's always going to be a lot of controversy between the upturned eye and the downturned eye, and how it affects the hooking of fish. And I don't think that the hook means a hill of beans difference. I've hooked and lost fish on just about every kind of hook that is conceivable, and my sense is when that fly is in the water, the faster the water, the more it's keeling and doing this, or not keeling, or being subject to less keel from the hook. And if that fish happens to hit that hook when it's like this, and doesn't get it hard, you're gonna lose the fish. If everything works out right and the fish takes the fly and turns and you get it in the side of the mouth, you got a really good chance of landing the fish. I could go on for hours, and I have, with clients and buddies that I fish with. I don't think it means a rat's ass difference what kind of hook you're using. Big fish, if you're landing 30% of your big fish, you're doing a good job. I'm gonna lay down a base layer. So this is my version of the Ingall's butterfly, and it's not by any means crazy innovative or anything like that. It's the Ingall's butterfly was traditionally had a red tail of just a red saddle hackle tail, just a few strands, and a yellow butt, and a white wing. But I had my father sailed with a gentleman. My dad. So my connection to you guys is only through my father. He was a career sailor, retired a chief petty officer, first class in 1986. So he spent 26 years in the Navy. So I grew up a military brat. But my dad sailed with a guy. His name was Neil Malik, and he actually taught my dad to fly tie, who taught me to fly tie. And this was one of Neil's patterns. And this is where my love for the Ingall's butterfly came to be. And the butterfly to me was just one of those flies that was different enough from everything else. And I've always been a big fan of different. So again, I'm just using that uni French tinsel, and for my butt, little bit of flash. And I'm going to make about 5 turns. And secure that. So I think I caught my first Atlantic salmon when I was 11 years old. And I can tell you, if you've got 20 minutes, I could take you through every step of that fish from when it ate my fly after 2 years of fishing for these goddamn things. I can take you through every step from when it ate my fly to when it was in the net, but I won't bore you with that. Atlantic salmon are more addictive than cocaine and more expensive. And if you get a chance, and you don't have to spend thousands of dollars to go Atlantic salmon fishing. I went with my dad 2 years ago. We had which was the last time I went to the Lower Humber River in Newfoundland, and we had a terrific 4 days. Stayed in a private cabin at the base of Marble Mount. Flights, booze, cigars, the whole 9 yards. For the two of us, $4,400. So it's not ridiculously expensive. But I'll tell you, if you love fly fishing, you owe it to yourself to go Atlantic salmon fishing. And I would help any of you out, with flies and patterns that you need anytime you want. But I've got a lot of connections, so
Hey, Lindsay,
just keep that in mind.
I'm going to go to.
So the butterfly has a little yellow tail, and this is just a uni yarn. Again, I'm going to make that, or not a tail, sorry, just an addition to the butt. I'm going to make that about the same length, maybe a turn longer than the tinsel butt. And I'll cut that off. I'm going to take that right back to the yellow. I'm going to try and find some longer strands of my Peacock herl here. And again, I'm going to look for about 5 or 6 of them because I always have to anticipate breaking 1 or 2. But the nice thing about the lack of natural materials is we now have a lot of synthetic materials like the you can get the Peacock ice dub and put that in a dubbing loop and then turn it on the hook and then trim it down. It looks just like Peacock herl. It's probably, realistically, it's probably more effective. But I'm going to secure that under the hook again, being careful not to put too much torque on that for the first couple of turns. And then take it back. Because you never, like, quite honestly, I don't consider myself a good fly tyer. I consider myself a very utilitarian fly tyer, which means I tie flies when for what and when I need to. I don't particularly enjoy tying flies, especially trout flies. I love tying Atlantic salmon flies, but yeah, I don't consider myself a great tie flyer by any means. So now I've tied in that dubbing loop. I've got the Peacock herl in. Now I'm just adding my rib. Okay. And I'm going to take that forward again, and I'm going to keep all of that Peacock herl in place again, just to keep that body a little more robust. The other thing you're not seeing me do here, every once in a while I pause if I'm going up making multiple turns on the hook. I pause. What I'm actually doing is I'm actually spinning the thread counterclockwise. If you ever get in a situation where you're breaking thread perpetually, sometimes, but not very often, it's a bad thing. It's a bad spool of thread. But more often than not, it just becomes so twisty that it's breaking. So if you stop and just basically every turn that you put in your thread, you're putting a twist in the line. So if you stop and just give it just like 10 turns back like that, you just sort of take that twist out and you will eliminate breaking your thread considerably. Does anyone do that? Mm-hmm.
I will now.
There you go. That was a Joe Pennish trick. Do you guys know Joe Pennish?
No.
No, but Tony, it's because you put too much tension in your thread. That's why.
What's that? Sorry?
He said, no, so I said to Tony, he's putting too much tension on his thread.
It
ain't moving.
I generally use so again, I've got the core and the thread, the dubbing loop, and the Peacock herl in it all together there, and I'm just going to start twisting it. And again, you're going to see that it starts to get more chenille-like at the front. Just got to remember when I do these things to wear appropriate shirts. That's not bad. You can see that pretty good. Now, I'm going to start turning it. I just got to avoid the camera there for a second. And one thing I didn't mention, I just kind of sweep that back on the bottom and the top of each turn. A couple of turns just to sort of reestablish that chenille-like quality. Again, you can see down here, it's very tight and it loosens as it gets up to cord there. So, couple of turns. And this is mainly for security as opposed to aesthetics. Although I think it does give a little better, I think it makes that Peacock herl a little more erratic, and you're going to get better light reflection off it. And catch up to my thread, secure that at the bottom. Oops. And that's it. Got a reasonably nice taper there. There's my uni French. And again, a fly this size, I'm probably going to be thinking of four wraps. I'm going to make one wrap right around and then start it forward. nice and even for the discerning eye. And again, finish it off on the bottom of the hook. He's a pretty cool cat. Anyway, so this is squirrel tail. Okay. A lot of guys will tell you you can't stack squirrel tail, but you can. You just have to beat it pretty hard. I'm gonna take a little more than I think I need, because you can always trim it back. And just like any hair that we use, it's important to get as much of the under fur out of that as we can. So there's my original clump. You can see, whoops, sorry. You can see it's kind of unruly there. You know, a lot of stragglers kicking out. If I take
Squirrel?
that, sorry, did I say squirrel? I meant calf.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
so too.
So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reorient that in my left hand, and I just want you to see, just with the use of a very simple little brush, just how much under fur I take out of that. See that? Now, once you get that under fur out, now you can stack it. You get those restrictive furs out, or the uneven furs, hairs out. Now I can put that in a stacker and stack it. And stacker. I'm gonna whack that. Wrong choice of words. I'm gonna knock that down a little more than I would with like a straight hair, like a squirrel tail or deer, because the calf tail is so sort of crinkly. I'm gonna knock that down a little more than I would with a straighter fur, and that should come out wonderfully. And reasonably even. See that? Very nice. So now I'm going to tie this in just as I would a traditional wing. I'm going to take it just beyond. I'm going to take it to the barb. Okay. Soft loop or pinch wrap. And one thing I'll tell you about hair, different hairs act or react differently to thread. When you're tying an elk hair caddis, elk hair or deer hair tends to have the only way I can describe it is almost a texture to it. And when the thread hits it, it doesn't move. The thread just kind of grabs into it, and you can do what you want with it. More coarse hair, like squirrel, calf, moose, it's slicker, harder. It's not hollow, for one thing. So when you're tying in a wing like this, if you turn that wing slightly towards you, and I'm going to guess and say about 30 degrees towards you, the thread torque, as you come over the top of it, the thread torque should align it on the top of the hook. If I start that right on the top of the hook, as if I was tying in an elk hair caddis, and my first turn, that hair is going to want to go off to the far side of the hook. So I'm going to start this hair slightly towards me. So I put it on just like I would, like I want it to set. And then I'm just going to give it a little 30 degrees this way with that soft loop. And when that catches up, it should, that wing should line up fairly on the top of the hook. Did that make sense, guys? Didn't make a bit of sense, did it?
Believe me, if it doesn't
Lost
work,
the
I'll tell you.
audience. Okay, so I'm going to tie this in, make sure it's good and secure. Cut that off. I'm going to cut that off at a bit of an angle. because I don't want that hair, the end here. I don't want that at a right angle. I want it on a bit of a cant, because when I'm forming my head, I want that thread to lay down nice and evenly rather than jump down and form a big lump. So I'm going to form up my head here, almost complete, and then come back. Now, I have to split that wing. It's good and secure. I'm going to take my one of my 200 needles I have on my desk that I can't find right now. There's one. And I'm going to split that right down the middle, sort of wolf style, as in Lee Wolf. I always like to reference one of the pioneers when I'm doing these fly tying things, just so you guys know I'm not a complete freaking cretin. So basically what I've done here is I've split this. I'm going to try and show you here. I've got that about halfway, and I'm going to figure eight. And this, again, this was always one of the things about the butterfly that attracted me, because it's just that much different. That split wing, everybody else is using blue charms and casa booms and rats and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, this split wing thing comes down over them. And you don't have to do a lot to split that wing. I've gone twice.
There we go.
So this is what we're trying to achieve. See that? Can you see? Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
We'll get a better look at it when I
Maybe put
take
your
it
hand
off.
directly behind it.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so now that would be a right or a side angle, and there's the
There you
split
go.
wing.
Oh,
Okay,
nice.
that's what we're looking for. And I mean, if you're really picky, I don't like that one side is just got to come out a little bit more. This is also a great pattern to riffle hitch and fish directly in the surface. Does anyone not know what a riffle hitch is?
Bueller, no.
I'll tell you in a second. So this pattern originally calls for just a brown saddle hackle. I'm going to take a webby piece of this this big hen or rooster butt. Find a nice big chunk of butt. There's nothing missing. I need a new rooster butt. Yeah, that will do. So we when I was a kid, we always fished public water, which means anyone could fish there. Nova Scotia, there was no private water like there was in New Brunswick and Quebec. And in the late 70s and 80s, you weren't legally allowed to start fishing until 6 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't like trout, where you were an hour before and an hour after sunset. In Atlantic Canada, you couldn't legally start fishing until 6 o'clock in the morning. So our cottage was on a lake just outside of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. And we lived with no less than 4 other salmon fishermen, like in our little cottage bay area. So it was always a race to get to the river. And it wasn't because you just wanted to be the first guy over the pool. In fact, I never wanted to be the first guy on the pool. Even if my dad, beat me out of bed and said, we got to get to the river. And you'd wake up and you'd see the 2 neighbors, Ken on the left-hand side, Bruce on the right-hand side, their lights on. And you'd see Bruce fire up his blazer. Dad would be like, okay, we got to go. And there'd be a race to the river. But that was just for pride. I always wanted to be the second or even third guy down over the river, because typically that first guy, he would move fish. He might move a couple or three fish on his way down. What I mean by move is just a raise, because these flies are only sitting, maybe 6 inches under the surface. So even if a 4-pound grilse comes up under it, he's going to move the water. So my thing was always, I want to be the second or third guy down, because if these guys don't hook those fish, then I at least know where they are. And I would always talk to them. What were you using? And I was using a Casa Boom, or I was using a blue charm. Okay, well, I'm going to go with something completely different. And I'm not saying like I hit it out of the park every time, but my theory was to go with something vastly different. If I saw the first 3 guys go down through the run with wet flies, and I know that a couple of them rose fish, I'd put a bomber on, or something like this that was just barely under the surface and creating a wake and just vastly different. Those are the little nuances of Atlantic salmon that are completely void in the trout world. We don't have the opportunity when we've got a 4-pound rising brown that's eating Hendrickson's. You don't have the option to be different, because he's not going to look at your fly. Atlantic salmon and steelhead are completely different. So I've just prepared that hackle, little quill exposed, and I'm going to put that in on the bottom and leave, again, a good amount of quill open, so that when I start, or quill exposed, so that when I start turning that on, I can get it going in the right direction. And start coming forward. Just going to pull those back on the top. Keep pulling them back on the top and the bottom of each turn. And that's what all I need. Oh, shoot. I lost it. Try that again. Again, I'm just going edge to edge with that quill, keeping them tight. Secure it. 1, 2, 3. And get in there. Pardon me, cut that off. Got that quill that's got to go. One little, part, just pull those back, help it out a little bit. And form up the head. And that's that. That is not my version, but the Lieutenant Neil Malik version of the Ingall's butterfly. And I would say, so I told you how much Atlantic salmon screw you up. In my lifetime, I have caught 281 Atlantic salmon. Yes, I'm counting. And I would say that probably 30% of those have come on one of the 2 flies that I just tied. And although I hate to admit it, the blue charm would be the next best. And I only hate to admit it because it's just too much of a cliche in the Maritimes to say the blue charm. But there is the Ingall's butterfly from sort of a top view. Again, this Neil Malik version without the tail. If you search the Ingall's butterfly, you'll see it has a red tag, and 90% of the time it's tied with white wings. But that's my version that has been as successful to me as any fly that I've ever fished.
Right on.
Questions?
So my 3-weight will not be good for Atlantic salmon.
Oh, no. Oh, no. Start with an 8, buddy. Start with an 8.
Yeah.
It all depends. If you can work it. Wolf did actually land at a 25-pound salmon with the 3 weights
Oh my
up in
God.
Labrador.
Oh,
And-
I'm sure it's been done, but it's not practical. We always so when at the beginning of the year, when the majority of the fish were larger salmon, we would fish 8 weights. But typically around the first week of July, we would get what we called the strawberry run, and you get a run of, I don't know, like 5,000 gross that would come in, and they were fairly aggressive. And most of the guys would continue to fish their normal rods, like their 8s and 9 weights. But my dad always dropped down to a 6 weight and just had a little more fun with them. And so that's what I do now. If I go salmon fishing and I know I'm going to be catching nothing but gross, then a 6 weight's fine. I mean, they're only 3.5, 4 pound fish. But to start out, and depending on where you go, you think 8 weight for sure.
Right on.
Because you don't want to overwork the fish, because you got to put it back in the water.
Yeah.
It's 6 weight, 5 weights. You'll catch a fish. You'll get it out, but it will be tired.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yep.
You got to look at the survival of the fish.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we're cheap. Okay, so
Rob, before you continue, just from a fellow Great Lakes steelhead angler, a lot of our flies, or some of the more, I guess you could call more the traditional Great Lakes steelhead patterns, do derive a lot of Atlantic salmon influence from Eastern Canada and Europe as well. And I was just wondering if there's anything that makes a Atlantic salmon fly uniquely Atlantic salmon, or could I just fly over to Newfoundland? I personally have never fished Atlantic salmon myself, or could I just fly over to Newfoundland and throw a hobo spay and catch Atlantic salmon? Is that a feasible? Like, is there any differentiation between the two species in the patterns?
that is a great question, and I was really hoping that someone would ask it. So Atlantic salmon flies are traditional. The Atlantic provinces and salmon fishing is a very conservative provincial sport. And I remember back about probably 15 years ago, I saw guys starting to put like flashaboo or crystal flash as an underwing under flies like this. And I remember the first thing I thought was, yeah, why would you do that? Then I, as I thought about it more, I thought, well, shit, why wouldn't you? These flies traditionally have been tied in the recipes that they were originally conceived, and that's what everybody fishes. The use now of more flashy materials like Krelex. I tied a bunch of, the last time I went to Newfoundland, I tied a bunch of blue charms, and I put like 3 strands of Krelex blue, like the steelhead blue Krelex under the squirrel tail wing of the blue charm, and that was the fly that freaking wheeled them. And I left it just a little bit longer than the wing. So if the wing was an inch long, I made those 3 little strands of blue Krelex. You guys, are you familiar with Krelex? It's kind of like a more gnarly flashaboo. It's just got a little more light reflective qualities. I'll find some before we go. Anyway, so I guess to answer your question is I don't have an answer to it because nobody does it. Nobody goes to Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and throws an intruder because it's not accepted. Your guide would look at you like you just dropped in a spaceship. So my sense is, yes, they would work. And I'll flip that around to about, if you guys remember, about 5 years ago, we had extraordinarily low conditions in the Great Lakes, similar to what we had this year, but for a prolonged period of time. Like it went until December. We were fishing summer lows on the Saugeen and the Maitland and everywhere else. And the flies that we're normally throwing for steelhead, like stuff like this, those bigger 2-station marabou type flies, weren't working. So I started tying some Atlantic salmon flies, and actually the one that really prevailed for about 5 weeks was a purple Ingall's butterfly, which I'm going to tie next. So what I did was I just kind of steelheadified it and made some blues and purples and that kind of thing. But tied on 6s and 4s, standard shanked hooks, that's what I started taking fish on just an intermediate, like a 10-foot intermediate sink tip on a floating line, and that fly was only maybe a foot under the surface. But even the deeper runs that we were used to fishing, the 4 and 5 foot runs, were now only 30 inches, maybe 3 feet deep. So that's what I started doing and started catching fish. So I think that's the sort of the flip to the question. Could the flies that we're using here, like the intruders and those larger 2-station flies that everyone in the Great Lakes is using, would they work for Atlantic salmon? I think that they would. The reality is nobody has given that a chance. So I'm going to Newfoundland on July 5th to shoot a show, and that's one of the things that I'm going to do. I'm going to fool around with that when I can. I'm going to take some bigger patterns and just see what happens. Because historically, and even in the UK now, they have like the Springer season in Scotland, Wales, and England, where the season opens in March, and they're not kelts. They're not fishing spent salmon. They're fishing fresh salmon. They call them springers. They just come in earlier than they do in North America, but they are chucking lures, big like little Clio type lures or whatever they use in the UK, and catching fish, because you can fish traditional gear in the UK. I didn't know if you knew that, but on many of the rivers you can. So I think the tradition of Atlantic salmon has just endured for so long that no self-respecting salmon fisherman would throw anything bigger than that unless it was really desperate. Did that make any sense to you?
Yeah, that made a lot of sense.
I don't know, but anyway, go back to Rusty Rat.
Yeah, but I did fish the couple of places in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and I use trout flies and I use salmon flies as much. And if salmon wants to take it, he'll take it. If he doesn't want it, he doesn't take it. Period. And the same way, I use salmon flies for trout fishing, and it does work. So
absolutely 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that there's when you're fishing to anadromous fish, your presentation and the way you cover the water is far more important than the pattern that you're using. Yeah. And a case in point, when I was a kid, I was probably 15 or 16 years old. I was fishing with a friend of mine again on the LaHaye River, and he was a trout fisherman and didn't have a lot of salmon flies. I gave him some, but he went back to a little black dry fly that we used to call the blue upright. Basically, what it represented the black quill, which is the predominant early season mayfly in Nova Scotia, because that's what Greg had caught the majority of his trout on. And I remember watching him. He had this grilse that was going crazy for this fly for about 3 casts before he finally hooked it. And he would throw it out, and just about every time he pulled it off the water, this grilse would come up after it. So that fish was clearly a taking fish. I think you've got taking fish, and you've got non-taking fish. And it doesn't matter what you put in. I fished the Gaspé enough in some of the clear rivers like the York and the Bonaventure. I've seen fish come from 12 feet away and eat a fly. Yeah. That fish is obviously aggressive. While 30 fish beside it are doing absolutely nothing. That gives you an idea of the percentages of what you're dealing with when we're talking about anadromous fish. And I think it's the same way with steelhead. And if I can just regress a little bit, I don't believe for a second that steelhead are eating. I shouldn't say that. I don't believe for a second that fall steelhead in particular, not so much the spring fish because we're fishing a lot of dropback fish, but I don't believe that steelhead in the Great Lakes that we're ever in a match the hatch situation. I can count on one hand, and I've probably caught between 1,000 and 1,200 steelhead. I can count in one hand how many fish that I killed and taken stomach samples of that have had food in their stomachs. They're eating more than Atlantic salmon because we know that Atlantic salmon aren't eating at all, not even a little bit. But steelhead are still trout. So if a particular fish was to get in behind a group of excavating salmon and there was an opportunity to eat dislodged eggs, yes, I think that they're going to take advantage of that. But within 10 days of entering the estuary and getting into the river, into that sort of 15 to 20 kilometer range, their feeding slows to an absolute crawl to the point that you are not in a match the hatch situation. And I'll argue that point with anybody because I used to kill a fair amount of fish, but I always took stomach samples. And the only times that I ever got stomach samples was very near the mouth of the river. And it was always during what I would consider opportunistic feeding times, a stonefly hatch, a lot of excavating salmon, that kind of thing. So I don't think that the fly you're using is nearly as important as how you're presenting it and how well and efficiently you're covering the water.
We hope you enjoyed Rob's tying and knowledge today. If you'd like to see more sessions just like this, please stay tuned on our YouTube channel, or if you'd like to register as a participant with Heroes Manning on the Fly Canada, get in contact with your provincial director or our national director, Gervais Jeffrey, through our website, heroesmanningontheflycanada.ca. We look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe, and thank you.